For the last 2 weeks, we saw how we started in Jaffa, then we went to Caesarea, then we went to Mount Carmel, to Megiddo, then we also went to Nazareth. We then took a trip up north as we stopped by Chorazin and Hazor, and then Tel Dan and Caesarea Philippi, and we ended the area here in Kursi. Now we're going to go back to the Sea of Galilee and start here at the Mount of Beatitudes. We're here on the Mount of Beatitudes. We don't know exactly where Jesus would have been. There's several hillsides around all of the Sea of Galilee, but picture here just somewhere along the hill. Jesus most likely would have been towards the bottom, and the people have been sitting up, creating kind of a natural amphitheater. The other thing here, it's pretty quiet today. It's easy to let your voice travel, but in those days, you don't have any extra noises, or even if the wind is behind you, it's pushing the noise up. As I think of even the idea of the feeding of the 5,000, 4,000, took place somewhere around here on these hills. But if you can imagine these hillsides, now they're covered more with agricultural things, but the hillsides being filled with people. And it's not the feeding of the 5,000 or 4,000 we're going to talk about here, but go back to the Mount of Beatitudes. It's called that simply because these are the Beatitudes that Jesus gave, found here in Matthew chapter 5. One day, as he saw the crowds gathering, Jesus went up on the mountainside and sat down. His disciples gathered around him, and he began to teach them. God blesses those who are poor and realize their need for him, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. God blesses those who mourn, for they will be comforted. God blesses those who are humble, for they will inherit the whole earth. God blesses those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they shall be satisfied. God blesses those who are merciful, for they shall be shown mercy. God blesses those whose hearts are pure, for they will see God. God blesses those who work in peace, for they shall be called the children of God. God blesses those who are persecuted for doing what's right, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. God blesses you when people mock you and persecute you and lie about you and say all sorts of evil things against you because you are my followers. And actually, even as a church, we're memorizing here Matthew chapter 5. It continues on. Matthew 5 and Matthew 6 is one long sermon that Jesus would have given around here. And it's interesting it begins this way because these are things that are almost opposite of the religious leaders in those days. So in those days, the religious leaders would have been about power. We saw in Chorazin, the seat of Moses, seeking after their own power. But all these things are about humility. And that we're blessed when we humble ourselves, when we suffer, when we go through trials, when we give up things for the cause of Christ, when we take care of others. The opposite of what the religious leaders of those days were all about. And it's just a reminder of the importance of the humility that Jesus displayed and showed, and that's what he wants to pass through his disciples. We travel from the Mount of Beatitudes to Mount Tabor. Judges chapter 4 is a passage we want to look at as we think of this narrative that happens in the Bible. And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. And the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in the region. Then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help, and he had 900 chariots of iron, and he oppressed the people of Israel cruelly for 20 years. Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at the time. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the people of Israel came to her for judgment. So we talk about the hill country of Ephraim. It's really right across the Jezreel Valley, and you see the hills there that kind of begin some of the hill country just past the hills of Gilboa, where we were a little bit earlier, the hill country of Ephraim. She sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, Has not the Lord your God of Israel commanded you to go and gather men at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun? And I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the river Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand. So somewhere below here would be the picture of the river Kishon somewhere. It wasn't a steady flowing river. It would be somewhere here in the Jezreel Valley. And basically they were going to draw the king into this valley would be the plan of what they were going to do. Barak said to her, If you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. And she said to him, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh, and Barak called out Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 men went up at his heels, and Deborah went up with him. So they all come to somewhere here on Mount Tabor. Now, we don't know if they came right to the top, but they came up here to Mount Tabor. It says, Now Heber the Kenite had separated from the Kenites, the descendant of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, and had pitched a tent as far away as the oak of Zimnam near Kadesh. When Sisera was told that Barak the son of Abinoam was gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera called out his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the men who were with him. And Deborah said to Barak, Up, for this is the day which the Lord has given Sisera in your hands. Does not the Lord go out before you? So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. So if you can imagine here, you look down in this valley and there's 900 chariots. Now understand, in those days, chariots were comparable to like tanks today. So if we think of the idea of we have no tanks, they have 900 tanks in this valley pointing at us, and now we're going to go and we're going to attack them with just on our feet. It's kind of like really, I wouldn't say like a suicide attack or kamikaze attack, but you have to have trust in the Lord that the Lord's going to give him into your hand. And the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and his army before Barak by the edge of the sword. And Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot. And Barak pursued the chariots and the army, and all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not a man was left. Now, it doesn't say here, but in Judges chapter 5, it gives the idea that the reason that Sisera got down out of his chariot was because God caused some great rain. Remember, we talked about the rain that happened in this valley, and Elijah told Ahab, you better go quickly. Well, if you could imagine here, all of a sudden the rain pours, your chariots are getting stuck in the mud, and that's probably what happened according to some of the song that was written about this in chapter 5. And eventually it says Sisera fled away to the foot of the tent by Jael, the wife of Heber the Canaanite, or the Kenite, for there was peace between Jabin and the king of Hazor. We'll be at Hazor tomorrow. And Jael came out to meet Sisera. And basically, eventually what happens is in there, he goes to sleep, and she drills a tent peg through his temple, basically fastening him to the ground is what the story goes. And it ends up to be that a woman gets glory for killing the commander and not Barak, who was the one who led the battle. So on that day, God subdued Jabin, the king of Canaan, and the hand of the Israel was pressed harder and against the king of Jabin until he destroyed Jabin, king of Canaan. So basically, God takes and delivers them. They come up to the mountain, they see all the enemy, but with the power and strength of God, again, you have a force that is way stronger than you. But that's what I love about all the Old Testament stories is when they failed to follow God's way, they ended up in a captivity, they ended up in problems, difficulties. When they followed God's way, which is often seemed to be the harder way at first, was often the times that they had the victory because they were willing to have faith, to trust that God was going to be more powerful than their enemy. And here we are at Mount Tabor, and we picture that God's great victory. Another thing we'll see is some people call this the Mount of Transfiguration. In fact, that's the church behind us that it's built. It commemorates the Transfiguration, if you remember, where Jesus, when it said he went up to the top of a mountain. And we don't know what mountain that was. Tradition kind of puts this as a mountain because this mountain sticks kind of out up in the middle of the land, so it's really unique. If you look at a lot of the other mountains, as we described even earlier, we're in Mount Gilboa, there's not one mountain, it's a mountain range. Same thing as Mount Carmel. But Mount Tabor is this really unique setting because it's just kind of this mound right in the middle of the field. And that's where a lot of people think that the Transfiguration, where Jesus took the disciples up the mountain, Peter, James, and John, and they went up there, and Moses appeared, and Elijah appears, and all of a sudden now there's this bright glory comes and just amazes the disciples. And finally they said, hey, let's make a monument here. Let's stay here. This is a great space. But Jesus knew he was going towards Jerusalem. That's why many people think it's here at Mount Tabor, because from Caesarea Philippi, where we'll be at tomorrow, from there it talks about Jesus setting his face to go towards Jerusalem. And even here he said, look, we're not going to stay here in all this glory because I have a purpose, as Jesus was focused on going down to the cross. And it was really neat if you think about that. Moses represented the law and Elijah represented the prophets. And it's kind of now Jesus is kind of fulfilling the law and the prophets by heading from the Mount of Transfiguration down south towards Jerusalem for his main purpose, to pay the price for our sins and to die on the cross. And so it's really symbolic on the Mount of Transfiguration that he did that, as he's setting his face towards Jerusalem. It said he set his face like flint, or this hard stone. He wants to go there for the purpose of doing what he came to this earth to accomplish. And this was really, we don't know where it was at. This could have been part of it, where he then was transfigured and then focused on fulfilling the law and the prophets. Here at Mount Tabor, this whole region here would be part of the Jezreel Valley, and these cities would be surrounding the Jezreel Valley. Right now what we're going to do is we're going to travel to a place called Ein Harod Springs, and that's where we'll have our next video. We're here at Harod Springs, or it's called Ein Harod Springs, and this goes back to the story of Gideon found here in Judges chapter 6. If you remember anything about the story of Gideon, we're told how the Midianites came through the valley and oppressed the people. So what happened year after year is they would grow crops, and then the Midianites would come up the valley, up the Jordan Valley, come through here, and they would eat their crops. So it'd be kind of frustrating if all you do is you grow everything, kind of like what deer do sometimes. You know, you grow all this food, and deer eat all the things from your garden. And so that's what they're doing, is basically they're eating their food. In Judges chapter 6, verse 11, then the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the great tree at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash, the clan of Abiezer. Gideon, son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of a winepress to hide the grain from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, mighty hero, the Lord is with you. Now this is interesting. We're going to go and visit a wine press, and we're going to visit a threshing floor later on this week. But the idea of a threshing floor would often be placed on the top of a hill. The wine press would be at the bottom of the hill. But what he's doing is he's threshing wheat at the bottom. See, when you would thresh in the top, you get the wind would blow the chaff away. But he's here at the bottom of the hill because he's really hiding from the Midianites. And that's fascinating, because what does the angel tell him? He says, "O Gideon, you mighty hero, you man of bravery, the Lord is with you." So here he is cowering in one sense, and God says, look, I'm going to make you a great hero. And Gideon, you can say whatever you want about him, but he's a man just like you and I are. If you had enemies over there, just in the valley, just a little way from us, and you are threshing wheat, you're going to want to kind of do it somewhere where they're not going to see, even if it's a lot harder. What I want to see here, and then we'll go up to the top and see the rest, is after Gideon called an army together, a lot of things happen in the story of Judges 6 and Judges 7. But Gideon finally calls an army together to fight the Midianites. In Judges 7, verse 1, so Gideon and his army got up early and went as far as the spring of Harod, which is right where we're at, the spring of Harod. And the armies of Midian were encamped north of them in the valley near the hill of Morah. In just a moment, we're going to climb the hill, and we're going to see where the valley of Morah is, and we'll explain that up there. But the Lord says to Gideon, you have too many warriors with you. If I let all of you fight the Midianites, the Israelites will boast and say they saved themselves. Therefore, tell the people, whoever's timid and afraid, you can leave this mountain and go home. So 22,000. So they originally started out with 32,000 men. 22,000 said, I am scared. I see the Midianites, the army. I don't want to do it. So there's 10,000 left. Verse 4, the Lord told Gideon, there's still too many. Bring them down to the spring. So this happened, it says up in the hill. So now they come down to the spring right here. And I'll test them to determine who will go with you and who will not. And Gideon took his warriors down to the water, which is right where we're standing. And the Lord told him, divide the men in two groups. In one group, put all those who cup the water in their hands and lap it with their tongues like dogs. And the other, put all those who kneel down and drink with their mouths in the stream. I don't know if anybody wants to illustrate kneeling down with your ear. I don't think we have to. No, we're not going to make you do that. But you picture them here, and you have these 10,000 soldiers that are left, and he divides them up. Basically, the idea is those who just stick their face in to drink compared to those who hold it up with their mouths, and there's only 300 people who do that. Verse 6 says, only 300 of the men drank from their hands. All the others got down on their knees and drank with their mouths in the stream. And the Lord told Gideon, with these 300 men, I'll rescue you and give you victory over the Midianites. Send all the others home. And Gideon collected the provisions and ram's horns and the other warriors and sent them home. But he kept 300 men. The Midianite camp was in the valley just below Gideon. And we'll show that in just a minute. But if you think about that, this whole valley filled with 10,000 soldiers. And out of that, only 300 are left. Now, it says that the Midianites were basically kind of like the sand of the sea. They were just scattered throughout the valley. And you're already going to have a problem defeating them with 32,000 men. And now you reduced your army to 300 men. In human means, could you imagine? I mean, that just to comprehend what God was doing and the bravery it would have taken. We always want more. Numbers are more. Numbers are everything. But I love the story because it's a reminder with God, numbers aren't important. And I think it's so important because a lot of times we want to think, well, if I had a bigger church, if we had more people, whatever it is. But really, God doesn't need that. God can do whatever he wants with whoever he chooses. So we're going to head on up the mountain and kind of tell the story as we'll see the vision out in front of us. So here we are at the top above Harod Springs. If you look in front of us, this direction here, that's Mount Morah. I talked about that earlier with the towers. Mount Morah, we're going to read about that in just a minute. If you go to the right here, it's the Jordan River Valley, and Jordan's there. And the Midianites would come up. They would join together with the Moabites and Ammonites, and they would all unite together here as one nation. But keep in mind that they weren't one nation. They were different nations all together, and they were like free food. Let's go to this over and over to the valley where the Israelites are growing. So we left after Gideon had 300 men. And what happened is, if you picture in this region, it said they were encamped somewhere by Mount Morah. So somewhere here in this valley, we don't know exactly where, but it talks about just the multitudes and multitudes, because they would travel with their families too. It wasn't just soldiers. They would come to bring food for everybody. So they would travel large groups with your animals and everybody. So they're encamped, as you see, picture all these houses that are in the valley. Those are enemy tents, and you have 300 soldiers. And you're going to go and destroy this nation that's camped here in this valley. God calls Gideon, and Gideon goes down at night and sneaks down into the camp, and he's by a tent, and he overhears them talking about they're fearful because God's going to give this battle to Gideon. They're fearful of the army of Gideon, not knowing it's only 300 men. So Gideon has the bravery because of that. He has the courage. He comes back in verse 16. And he divided the 300 men into 3 groups and gave each man a ram's horn and a clay jar with a torch in it. And he said to them, keep your eyes on me. When I come to the edge of the camp, do just as I do. As soon as all those with me blow the ram's horn, blow your horns too. All around the entire camp, shout for the Lord and for Gideon. So he tells them what we're going to do is we're going to divide up around the camp. So picture it's a large camp, so they're kind of spreading out. It's not like this little group. And it says to go around the edge of the camp. We don't know exactly the camp was here. It says it was more by Mount Morah, so maybe it was over there at the base of that hill. So some of them could have been on the hill. We're not really sure. Then he said all 3 groups, we go back, it was just after midnight, after the changing of the guard, when Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the Midianite camp. Suddenly they blew the ram's horn and broke their clay jars. Then all 3 groups blew their horns and broke their jars. They held the blazing torches in their left hand and the horns in their right hands, and they all shouted, "The sword of the Lord and for Gideon." Each man stood at his position around the camp and watched as the Midianites rushed around in panic, shouting as they ran to escape. When the 300 Israelites blew the ram's horn, the Lord caused the warriors in the camp to fight against each other with their own swords. Basically, the Israelites had very little to do with this battle. All they do is encircle the camp in 3 groups. They spread out, and it causes panic among the camp, thinking that they are just under attack, under siege. The Midianites kill each other. We know that there were other nations. They join in, and they're all fighting each other. It's midnight. It's chaos. Pitch dark here. They don't know what's going on. They don't have their torches lit. And basically, many of them are destroyed. We know further on, the story says that they started to run away someplace. Gideon then gathered some of the soldiers that left, that went home or departed, and they came and joined him. And basically, they chased them out, and God delivered them from the hand of Midian. When you think about that, I mean, picture this, and we don't know the size of it. Again, it just says that they covered the whole valley. And just imagine all that area full of enemy armies. You have 300 people. But yet with God's power, you can do it. Just as we saw with Elijah, one person calling down fire from heaven. Here we have the power of God through Gideon. And I think the thing for us to remember is it takes a willing soul. It doesn't mean we have to be the bravest person. Where was Gideon? He was at the threshing floor, or he was at the wine press doing the threshing. He was scared. But God sees the potential in us when we're willing to submit and do whatever he calls us to do. He can do great and mighty things through us. And I love that story of Gideon, and just being able to see it and understand somewhat more of how this would have taken place in God's great deliverance. From the Springs of Gideon, we go to our next stop in Beit She'an. This is the area where the Jezreel Valley runs into the Jordan River Valley. So we're here on the top of Beit She'an. Just to give you a bearing, if you look over here to your left, my right, those are going to be the mountains of Jordan. In those days, the Moabites, the Ammonites, as well as part of the tribes of Israel were given that land, but they lived over in that direction through the Jordan Valley. Behind us, it's hard to see almost directly behind me, those would be part of the mountains of Gilboa. Remember, we were up on the top there yesterday. We drove on the ridge of Gilboa, basically starting on this end, and we drove that whole ridge and we came down. Those are the mountains of Gilboa. And so this was Beit She'an, so this would have been a city. So we're on top of where the ancient city would have been, because again, they built up high for fortification in those days. You wanted safety, so you would build up high. Often you would do your farming and stuff down low, but it was a great spot for fortification. Not mentioned too often in the Bible. Again, in the New Testament, it's just mentioned as part of the Decapolis, not really much of a mention. But in the Old Testament, we have this account. Now the Philistines attacked Israel, and the men of Israel fled before them. Many were slaughtered on the slopes of Gilboa, again, which would be behind us. The Philistines closed in on Saul and his sons, and they were killed, all three of his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Melchishua. The fighting grew very fierce around Saul, and the Philistine archers caught up with him and wounded him severely. Saul groaned to his armor-bearer, "Take your sword and kill me before these pagan Philistines come and run me through and torture me." But his armor-bearer was afraid and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When his armor-bearer realized that Saul was dead, he fell on his own sword and died beside the king. So Saul and his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his troops died together on the same day. So again, that's the mountain ridge behind us, a little bit hard to see, the mountains of Gilboa. And you think, it says the Philistines, you wonder why the Philistines were here. So if you remember, we talked earlier when we were on the on our way up from Tel Aviv. There was a flat area we talked about. That's the Philistine territory. Some of that was given to Dan. Dan didn't take it. What were the Philistines doing up here? Is they would take that pass. We talked about, or not that pass, but the pass by Megiddo. There's a valley by Megiddo that goes to the Jezreel Valley. The Jezreel Valley connects to this valley. So if you remember that, the mountains of Gilboa were overlooking part of the Jezreel Valley. This connects to this area, which is the Jordan Valley. And this is a spot where the Jordan Valley and Jezreel Valleys kind of run into each other. This would have been the main area, basically, when they would be going to, like from Nazareth or Galilee and going down to Jerusalem. They would have passed somewhere here in this region, here in the Jordan Valley somewhere. They would have their ancient pass they would go on. But let's go back to our scenario here. Saul is dead. He's died in the mountains of Gilboa. It says, when the Israelites on the other side of the Jezreel Valley and beyond the Jordan saw what the Israelite army had done, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their towns. They fled, so the Philistines moved into their occupied towns. So all the towns up the Jezreel Valley, we understand that. We've been there. And all those towns there now, the Israelites are scared. They go back basically into the hills of Ephraim and back in the safety of the mountains. And now the Philistines have free reins of the plain. They have the Jezreel Valley for food, and they take their cities. And this was one of the cities here because this borders the Jezreel Valley with the Jordan Valley, and this was one of the cities that they would have taken. The next day, when the Philistines went out to strip the dead, they found the bodies of Saul and his 3 sons on Mount Gilboa. So they cut off Saul's head and stripped him of his armor. Then they proclaimed, just a moment, this went small on me, there we go. Just a second, I hit the wrong button. I'll pause that out, there we go. Verse 8 says, the next day when the Philistines went out to strip the dead, they found the bodies of Saul and his 3 sons on Mount Gilboa. So they cut off Saul's head and stripped off his armor. Then they proclaimed the good news of Saul's death to their pagan temple and to the people throughout the land of Philistia. They placed his armor in the temple of the Ashtaroth, and they fastened his body to the wall in the city of Beit She'an. One of the reasons that they would have been here, that Saul would have fought in the first place, is the Philistines had already moved into some of this land. And it appears from this that they had already conquered Beit She'an, and that's why Saul was coming out to try to defend Beit She'an. If you remember, Saul was the first king of Israel. Other than that, it was ruled by judges, which were kind of a bunch of patches of people, city-states and patches of people. And Saul's starting to unite the nation of Israel, but much of the land had been taken over by the Canaanites. Some of them, the different versions, I guess you would say, of Canaanites, the different people of that. And as part of that were the Philistines. They move in here to Beit She'an. They have a temple on top of this mount that we're going to see kind of remnants of some temples here in a moment. So what they do is they place his armor in the temple of the Ashtaroth, and they fasten his body to the wall of the city of Beit She'an. Now I'm assuming there would be walls around this high hill that we're on top of, and so they fasten his body there basically as a symbol of shame to the Israelite people. But when the people of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their mighty warriors traveled through the night to Beit She'an, and took the bodies of Saul and his sons down from the wall. They brought them back to Jabesh, where they burned the bodies. Then they took the bones and buried them beneath the tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and they fasted there for 7 days. So Jabesh Gilead would actually be across the Jordan River. You hear the land of Gilead is the land across from the Jordan River. Again, today would be modern day Jordan. The people in the town there, somewhere there to the south, I can't tell you exactly where it's at from here. They hear about it. They're not too far away. And they come here at night. They take the body of Saul down to avoid the disgrace, and they take care of his bones in a proper way. And that's really the main mentions here of Beit She'an. We do know, though, historically, we're going to see some remnants of an Egyptian palace, not really palace, but Egyptian like guard tower that was stationed here. That predates the time of really the Israelites traveling the land. We're going to see some of that. The Canaanites lived here for several years. They built temples and palaces. The Israelites, when they came in, they pushed people out, but many of them came back in, as we've seen already. And at this time, the Philistines would have been here. And then finally, eventually, once David came in, he conquered many of the cities, and David and Solomon then expanded the kingdom to be all part of the one nation of Israel. Now we take the 2-hour trip down from Beit She'an as we head down the Jordan River Valley to Nevi Zohar, which is on the Dead Sea. It's a beautiful morning here at the Dead Sea. If we look across from us, we see the mountains, which would have been Moab, as Moab and Ammon, as well as the bottom half of the Dead Sea would be Edom in the days of the Bible. This is not mentioned that often in the Bible, but it is called the Great Salt Sea. And one of the main reasons is because of the high content of salt and minerals. Even if you see out there, there are things floating that look like icebergs. Those are actually basically salt patties or platforms. That is, the salt gathers together and collects. And one of the unique things about this water is the content of salt is so high that it causes anyone in there to float. Nothing can really live in the water. No fish, no animals can live there because the salt content is so high. And when you go out there and swim, you just kind of float there in the water. It's almost 1,300 or over 1,300 feet below sea level, one of the lowest spots on Earth. And it's really quite an amazing experience. One of the great illustrations from this, it's not a biblical illustration, but for our Christian life, is we have a lot of inflow into our life through the Word of God, the understanding of God's Word, the teaching of God's Word. But just like the Dead Sea, the water flows into it, but there's no outflow. There's no river that leads out of the Dead Sea. The water just comes and stagnates. I think the same thing in our Christian life. When all we have is inflow and study and understanding of the Word of God, but it never flows out of our life in service or by loving others and reaching out and sacrifice, we often kind of become dead because it's all about us rather than us outflowing what God has done or put inside of us. From our hotel, we take the short ride up north along the Dead Sea to the fortress city of Masada. We get into the cable car and we start heading up to the top of Masada. So here at the top of the Masada, we just came up here the snake path. We didn't come up the snake path, but we went over the snake path. And we came in, so we're right about here right now. What we're basically going to see is this side of the mountain. Over here you see there's a lot more, but even from this, we probably won't go into any of that because there's really not a whole lot. This land, though, was actually used for crops. They would grow their own crops on top of this area with the water. It looks so dry and arid, but this soil grows, if you just add water, it grows a lot. We're going to mainly come up here, and then we're going to end up kind of down here This here first, we're going to go to like the captain's house. They think that this would have been where the captain would have been. Then these are storehouses. All these things, we're going to see how big they are. They were storage. When they would grow the crops, they would store them. This in the front is the king's palace. We're going to explore that. Over here would be for guests to stay if they came to visit the king. And then over here, there is another palace. Most likely a guest or the king would be here for a bit. And then there's a bathhouse here we'll look at. So understand what Masada was. Masada was not a regular place to live. It was built for two reasons. The main reason was Herod was very scared. And so if somebody comes to attack Herod for his personal safety, he can come up to the top of this, and it's really tough for any opponent to come and conquer you, because it's really, there's one way up to the top of Masada. So that's part of the reason. The second reason, it was also to be sometimes like a winter place to go to. If it got real cold up near Jerusalem or Caesarea, you come down here where it's warm and retreat just a little bit. We don't know how much time, if Herod even spent that much time up here. We don't really know that, but a lot of it is more just what he could do. We've seen a lot of things that Herod built, and a lot of it is what he could do. Eventually then, we saw in the video how the Jews came up here, and we'll talk about that more as we finish off how they kind of ended that time, but we'll discuss that when we get a little bit more. But we'll go on and start to see some of these things as we tour around. This is the edge, the northern edge where Herod's palace would have been. It would have been a layered palace. This would be the entrance layer where we'd be at. Down below there'd be this kind of living quarters would be there. You can also see the siege forts. If you guys looked and saw the siege forts here, there's another one there, and you also see the wall that connects all these. So they took the time to build this wall completely around. Even if you look to your left up here, up the hill, they built part of their wall up the hill. Like, why you would do that, because you can barely climb the hill, and there's part of it, you can see some remnants if you look towards the top, and you see that other siege fort over there that they built that. And the Romans did that in 70, so that was after Herod. That's when the Romans attacked here, when the Jewish rebels came up to this area. And we'll talk about the Jewish rebels a little bit more in just a minute. So this would be the reconstruction of Herod's palace. We were just up here on the top looking down to the north, but there would be two other levels that Herod would have originally built somewhere right around 30 BC. Again, we have two different time periods. We have when Herod builds this as a sanctuary place, a place for safety or a place to come in the wintertime or to show off. And then you have later in 70 AD, really between 66 and 70, where the Jewish rebels and others would join them, and they came up here to live to try to stay away from the Romans who were invading and wanting to kill them. This would be the bottom terrace on the northern end that would overlook here the Dead Sea. If we look around behind us, you look up and you see that the second terrace, the middle terrace, and then all the way on the top would be the top terrace. And we're going to see in just a moment some of the actual, again, type of wallpaper that we saw before. So here would be some really unique things. I said a type of wallpaper. If you look along the wall here, this stuff is a recreation of what it would have looked like, because having it exposed to the sun would basically destroy it. So they've taken the original and they have them in a museum. But behind us, we see part of the original. So this over here would have been part of the original wall of the palace, just like we saw in the commander's house. We would see this here again. This was plaster, and as they would put the plaster on, while it was wet, they would put the colors on, and then the colors would soak in, and that's how they would design it. So what we'd see many times are a bunch of rocks are not rocks. It's the foundation, like the stud walls, but they would have it covered and it'd be a beautiful palace down in this area. Bathhouse here that Herod built. What you have is a few things. This would be like a sauna. And what they did, as you see the example here, is they would put their flooring on these pillars. Through here, there would be a stove that would be heating things up, and it would send hot air into the region. And you look along the wall here, and those are pipes. So the steam would come up through the pipes or the hot air. You see all over the walls has remnants of where those pipes would have been. And it would have been like a big sauna, part of the Roman bath system that Herod would have had. Again, the walls would have been plastered. These things would have been covered and plastered, and most likely be decorative plaster, just like we saw in many of the other rooms. The bathhouse here, and you can see how there would have been like a water trough. That water would be led down into there through the hole. There'd be some type of oven that they would use to create steam and heat that would go into heating the area up inside the sauna, basically. Much to it to show, except this is where they found the lots. So what happens is the Jewish rebels come up here in 72. The Romans are about to come in the next morning. They broke down the wall eventually, as we're going to see through the siege ramp. And what happens, they believe, is there were almost 1,000 up here, 1,000 Jews that had escaped, and they killed one another. And these, they believe, now we don't know for sure, were like the lots of the last person to live, and each person would kill basically the next person. They would draw lots, and that's what they think they found in this room. The big question here in Masada is, how do you get the water to survive? How do you get the water to last? If you're under siege up here, how do you get the water to have crops? Because you're going to plant crops up here and grow things up here. And Herod, being a master engineer and builder, built an incredible way to do this. If you look in the mountains around us, what he did, he built channels in the mountains, having to use probably some aqueducts at times or places to be able to cross, like bridges and gaps. And if we see the example here, Grant's going to help us, and he's going to pour some water here as rain comes down. And rain comes down, these cracks, what happens? Pour quite a bit more here. It's a heavy rain. It's a big downpour. It's a big downpour. Go ahead. So the water comes down these cracks.
Not going in the right direction.
In here, and then there's cisterns all along here.
And they were grabbing the water.
They have big cisterns into the wall that are all along here. And then what they'd have is they have a path where they would have a donkey, they would fill these up, and they would bring those and fill up the other cisterns. So they had 12 big cisterns in the side of the wall, and then there's almost 20 over the whole area that they would fill up, and that's how they would get their water to be able to survive up. We talked before about sieges and besieged cities. So what happened in AD 66, the Romans came through under Titus and Vespasian, and they basically wanted to quell the Jewish rebellions once and for all. They destroyed Jerusalem. Many Jews escape, especially the Jews that were militants, and they come and they find this place, Masada, and they find it, there's just maybe a few Roman guards that they overthrow, and they come here, and eventually 1,000 people. We're not sure if they're all rebels, they're referred to as rebels. It could just be refugees. So they're on the run from the Romans, hoping to spare their lives. Whenever you siege a city, what a sieging army would do is they would surround the city. And their idea is they would try to outlast the people inside the city. The people inside the city would try to outlast the people outside the city. So you see part of the Roman garrison up there. There were 5 or 6 of these around. The Romans in 2 years' time, well, basically almost from 70 to 73 AD, 3 years' time, besieged this area. And what they would do is there is a spring, and most likely that's where the Romans, about 5 miles away, it's Spring of Engedi, that's probably where the Romans got their water. Up here, they would use the water from the cistern. They would use the food that was stored in the storage bin. So you have this group of Jewish rebels that are waiting here, and day by day, they see the Romans build the wall. You see remnants of the wall even over there. You probably can't on the video, but those who are here, you can see remnants even going up the hill. There's remnants of the wall they build around this whole area. In the process, they're also building what we see in front of us. This is a siege ramp. So they take time to move all of this dirt and build that. This was probably the easiest part they figured to be able to breach the walls. So they come up with the Roman mechanisms here, and they come up to a certain point where they can breach the walls. At that time, it says that the Jewish rebels put stacked wood up to help hold the wall up, and to keep the brick from falling down, from being rammed over. It talks about eventually that they were going to, the ramming part was started to be on fire, but then it caught the wood wall on fire, allowing them to basically break the wood wall and the brick wall down. So that night, we're told that the Romans decided to go to bed and they're ready to come and invade the city the next morning. And that's where that night, the 1,000 rebels that were here with their leader decided what they were going to do. Instead of becoming slaves, instead of finding themselves captured or beheaded or taken, whatever the Romans would do, torture them, they decided they would kill themselves. And that's why we saw the pieces of pottery earlier. We didn't see the pieces of pottery, but where they found the pieces of pottery is basically it's thought that they all took turns killing their families. There were 10 left, and then the one who drew basically the short straw, we would say, or drew the pottery, would be the one that would kill the other ones. The Romans come up, they invade the next morning, they find almost 1,000 Jews dead up here. There were only a couple women and a couple children that hovered in one of the rooms that they found left alive. We don't know what happened to them. History doesn't record anything about what happened to them. And basically the Romans then take over this fort, and really they just station people here for a while, and then eventually it becomes abandoned because there's really no reason to be up here in this area. I hope you've enjoyed today's tour. Again, I do apologize that the video isn't always the best quality because of the sound, but I hope you get to learn from this, and I hope you're drawing some things out and maybe excites you that maybe one day in the future you can join me here on a tour to the land of Israel. So from Jerusalem, this is just a sneak peek of where we'll be next week as we continue our virtual tour through the Holy Land.